Good afternoon, and thank you for being here today. I'd like to take a moment to thank Marion Calder and these folks here at the Horry County Museum for giving us this opportunity. My role at the beginning of this program is just to introduce today's presenters, so I'm going to ask them to stand, and as I introduce them, Taylor Pierce is a lifelong resident of the Myrtle Beach area. She's currently in her senior year at Coastal, pursuing a bachelor's degree in history with minors in War and Society and Social Studies. Taylor aspires to further her education and develop a career in archival studies, helping to preserve and interpret historical narratives. Jordan Blazer is pursuing a master's degree at Coastal. She earned her Bachelor of Arts in History in 2024 with minors in Political Science and Religious Studies. Originally from Detroit, Michigan, she's called South Carolina home since 2007. Jordan belongs to the Phi Alpha Theta History Society and, as an undergraduate, was a frequent President's List awardee. Keilani D'Antonio is originally from North Wildwood, New Jersey. She received her associate's degree from Horry Georgetown Tech and is now pursuing a Bachelor's of Arts in History with minors in Women and Gender Studies and Social Studies. She is an entrepreneur operating a design and jewelry business right here in Conway and enjoys spending time with her friends, family, and pets. Connor Mojo is in his junior year at Coastal, majoring in both political science and history, as well as a minor in philosophy. Having been raised in Conway, Connor is especially interested in local history and the history of the colony of South Carolina. In 2023-24, he received the Coley Prather Scholarship in Low Country History. Connor plans to continue his studies into graduate school and eventually hopes to become a professor. With that, I'd like to ask Taylor to come on up, and I'll turn the program over to her.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Taylor, as Dr. Navin said. I'm up here just to give some background on Kingston, a little bit on South Carolina, but mostly Kingston, which would later become Conway. So let's start in 1715 with the Yassami War. The Yassami War was a conflict between British colonists in South Carolina and the Yassami Native American tribe. It was a result of the capture, enslavement, and export of Native Americans in South Carolina to work in the sugar fields in Barbados. The Yassami and their allies would almost overrun the frontier and nearly overran Charleston, and this caused a lot of fear and vulnerability in the settlers of South Carolina. So in response to this, Governor Robert Johnson of the time had to come up with a plan, so he developed a township scheme, which was meant to populate the frontier and protect Charleston. So Kingston was included in the encouragement and development. It was one of the 11 towns that Governor Johnson developed. It was established in 1732, and it had the strategic purposes of protecting it, but it wasn't ideal for commerce or agriculture. The area was surrounded by swamps and rivers and an ocean, so it was very isolated for the residents of the area. This map, I do have a pointer, but if you look right next to the H, that is where we are. That's Conway. It's right there. I know it's kind of hard to see. The pointer was there. But that is Kingston, or Conway Borough. In 1757, the population was very small, but it did remain pretty stable. By 1801, Kingston District was renamed to Conway County, and then at the same time, Kingston itself was renamed to Conway Borough, and both of those changes were made in honor of military veterans. So Horry County had an abundance of danger within its swamplands. The dense swamps were inhabited by insects, dangerous reptiles, and potentially a number of runaway slaves. So this area was significantly isolated, and it made it even more of a danger coming to the area. Like many settlers in rural North and South Carolina, residents of Horry County depended on the production of naval stores to produce an income. So turpentine distilleries, sawmills dotted the local landscape. Horry became one of the largest timber-producing districts or counties in South Carolina in the 1860s. Unlike Georgetown and other low country settlements to the south, Horry was not suited for the cultivation of rice. Later, Horry County would start to produce tobacco, but that doesn't happen before the Civil War. There is an 1850 census, and it recorded at the time there was about 2,000 enslaved African Americans in Horry County, but there was twice as many whites in the area. The demographics for neighboring Georgetown were dramatically different. As you can see, there were 2,193 whites in Georgetown, but there were 18,253 enslaved African Americans, with 201 free African Americans. Long after it was founded, Horry County remained a very poor, isolated backwater. The farmlands of the area were valued at less than $600. And despite its isolation, Horry County residents remained vitally interested in the national politics, especially during the turmoil of the 1850s. In the 1860 presidential election, Republican anti-slavery candidate Abraham Lincoln won a sweeping victory. And due to its political climate of the time, South Carolina was one of the first to secede after Lincoln's election. Soon, 6 more states would follow, and they formed the Confederacy in early February of 1861. 4 more states would join this Confederacy as well after the surrender of Fort Sumter. But due to this surrender from all these states, there became a market for local newspapers. No one really wanted to depend on the area that they were going against now. So that's where we get into the Horry Dispatch. So the publishers of the Horry Dispatch had already worked on other papers. As you can see here, they have this prospectus that they released to say that they wanted to release the Horry Dispatch. If you look in the far corner, there's that little picture, Gilbert and Darr Publishing. Those are the publishers of the Horry Dispatch, and they released this to promote their upcoming paper so people would want to be interested in it, especially in this small area. So Gilbert and Barr were the publishers of the Richmond Dispatch and the Sumter Watchman in Sumter, but they formed the Horry Dispatch. They have pictured here that is Noah Graham Austin, and they let him run the venture, a solo venture, whenever they first started it. And there was a lot of concern about this because he was 18 years old whenever he took on the sole publication and running of this newspaper. And there was a lot of questions in that in our research. And we found out that they picked him because Noah Graham Austin got into the newspaper business whenever he was just 13 years old. He started with a 5-year apprenticeship under the same publishers, and his apprenticeship ended right at 1861, and that's when the Horry Dispatch said they had kind of a surplus of materials they wanted to utilize, so they wanted to produce this newspaper, and Austin jumped on it, and he moved to this area, and he ran it all on his own initially. So the first edition to be released was March 4th, 1861. That was the first issue, and it was the first ever paper produced in Horry County. It was about 5 weeks before the war began that the first issue was released. About a month later, of April of 1861, the editorship did pass to Joseph T. Walsh, but Osteen still assumed other responsibilities within the newspaper as well. The majority of the information within the Horry Dispatch is taken from other newspapers. There are some aspects within it that are personal correspondence, official reports, legislative announcements, and notices, but the big ticket items in it are usually taken from other newspaper sources as well. They shared information. As you can see here, this is just an example of what can be found whenever we were researching it. This is not the first edition that was released, but it's the first edition that we can see because we don't have access to every single one of them. And this is just the first 2 pages. So the first page is usually miscellaneous items, short stories, poems, those kind of things to bring the readers in. Then the second page, as you can see, is more filled with the local of the time. England and France, Beauregard's dispatches, the ratification of the Constitution. Usually those are found within the middle of the newspaper. This just kind of highlights the different conditions that we can see within the Horry Dispatch. Some of them do have big spots on them. We can't read every single edition, but the condition does vary from newspaper to newspaper. These were our goals whenever we established this research, student research. We wanted to create a database so that we could utilize these newspapers rather than just having this big mass of newspapers that couldn't get utilized. So we went through and we wanted to look at all the categories in there, what was related to war, what was related to politics or economy or slavery, what miscellaneous items are in there. And we wanted to give like a short summary so we could give it to people. So this is an example of how our database looked for every article we read within the newspaper. Up at the top, we had the date that it was released. If it was pulled from a different newspaper, we put that as well. So the Richmond Dispatch did this one. We had a URL link so we could easily access it if we wanted to bring it to people. There's a picture of what it looked like. And then on the bottom, we usually summarized it, or we did like an interesting quote that was taken from it. And that was kind of how we developed this database. Step 2 was to try to accurately get the information out, to get a timeline, what sources of information were in there, and develop it a little bit more, examine more of the articles, the notices, that kind of thing. We wanted to understand the contribution of Horry County residents to the war at this period. What did they give to it? And just create and develop a timeline. And now I'm going to ask Kaylani to come up, and she's going to give you a deeper look into what's in the newspaper.
Hello, so my name is Kaylani, and I look a lot into the content and what is covered in the newspaper. So besides like the typical war correspondence and information, there's a lot of advertisements, notices from different people and companies, and other topics for pleasure such as short stories. A majority of the advertisements lived on the last 2 pages of the paper, and there was between 50 and 60 per issue. They varied on the page count and varied across a large variety of topics, and these are an insight into how Horry County was doing economically whenever there aren't like modern day databases with information and such like this. The advertisements we separated into a few general categories. Those are newspaper subscriptions, generalized merchandise, hotel advertisements, miscellaneous products and services, as well as notices, which include like cash-only payments, debt notices, sheriff sales, and notices for leaving the area, specifically for war to either Virginia or Georgia. This information I tracked through a 3-sample database, which you can see in this graph. So this is an example from April 11th, 1861 issue. The data tracked was type of product, and the largest products in this issue were generalized merchandise, newspaper subscriptions, property sales, and hotels. They make up a large portion of the newspaper in this issue, specifically with advertisements. Newspaper subscriptions were the largest part of the previous issue, and as you can see, they are heavily featured in a variety of areas. Major newspapers that were both being cited for sources and both advertising their own papers were the Richmond Examiner and the Charleston Mercury. Major businesses and firms advertising in the Horry Dispatch were B.J. Singleton and Company, Stockley and Oldham, and B.D. Taylor and Company. These companies have a lasting impact in our area through the grave sites and other business history. Other than the advertisements, a large variety of topics and subjects are covered in the Horry Dispatch. Slavery is a large topic in the Civil War, yet was barely covered in the Horry Dispatch. The only mentions of slavery tended to be either advertisements for runaway slaves or advertising the selling of enslaved people. Slavery was a minority of the community, as seen in the previous graph by Taylor, and due to the lack of slaves, it was very rarely mentioned. Notices like the ones on the right portrayed to Confederate money as a lot of fake currency was being brought into the economy in the area, and a large amount of the previous businesses had moved to cash-only sales in order to up their amount of money being brought in with the scarcity of both people in the area and the move to not rely on like a barter system. So bills like the one on the bottom, that is a fake bill, and those tended to flood in from the north, and a large majority of them are made by a rather famous man from Philadelphia who did it actually as a scheme for tourism. Small bits of information that were for pleasure occurred in the paper commonly. These would have a religious undertone or were just for pleasure and done as jokes or little tidbits of information like these. These letters are by John Beatty, and he was camped in Georgetown during combat. This was information that we found alongside the newspaper through our CCU libraries. His relation to Beatty Taylor and Company and the fact that his letters were saved gives us a perspective of what it was like for business owners who were sent away in the war and what they felt about Conway Borough. Poetry was a reoccurring theme in the first pages of the issue. Poetry commonly had a positive religious view and sentiment. And they were normally pulled from either other newspapers or they were pulled from actual books that were published during the time. Like most papers, obituaries were common in every newspaper, and they shared information such as who died and what their family felt about the sentiment. Marriage and the expectations of married people were also a hot topic in the newspaper. Sections like the above were commonly filled with advice told through a short fictional story or a short example. Women and the idea that they should be conservative to men in their lives was a common theme across all issues in the For Pleasure section. Women were needed to not only be conservative, but perfectly poised and a supporter of the family, especially as the war went on and men tended to leave the area. They were keeping not only their families fed, but keeping their community alive. These were written for both males to read and women, with information of what one should look for in a wife, what a wife should do, and what a wife should expect to have in a relationship. Information was not only for pleasure, but for survival, as blockades made food scarce and the economy deteriorated. Tidbits of information were as simple as how to best grow corn, how to save your cows from disease, hay harvesting tips to be able to get the most out of your crop, or how to save a family from starving by making less into more. Local news was a generic manner in most of the listings. They included mail schedules, when the doctor would be in town. The articles on the left-hand side of the board are a soldier's relief board that was brought up. So this was both in the Union and the Confederacy. Both government did this, and it gave services and goods to those fighting in the war and gave them like federal or local assistance whenever they needed help. Confederacy news included in miscellaneous as much as it did not relate to battle specifically, but more for information for the area about what was happening in the Confederacy at large. This included stuff about the new Confederate flag, postage costs across the Confederacy, and across Confederate states. Now I leave this section up to Jordan.
So, as Kaylani said, I'm Jordan, and I'm going to talk you through the politics, the conflict, and the public sentiment seen in the Horry Dispatch, and a little bit of coverage of some events they published as well. So, at the start of the paper, you can already see early preparations for war or future conflict in Horry County. At the start of 1861, Horry County saw the completion of Fort Randall. It's located in the eastern end of Little River Neck. It's now known as Tillman's Point. It was built to protect Little River in itself, and later it would be used as a safe haven for blockade runners. During a flag-raising ceremony, Captain Litchfield gave a speech. Within the speech, he thanked residents for any materials they donated, especially lumber. He stoked fervor and encouraged Southerners to believe that they were leaving the past behind and they were making the right choice. The fort was later captured by a Union Navy lieutenant, by Cushing, in 1863. But throughout this speech that they published in their first issue of April 11th that we had access to, you can see the Dispatch had a very high note of confidence and optimism when it came surrounding the conflict. Similar to Horry County, war preparations were also underway in the Low Country. In March, Jefferson Davis ordered General Beauregard to take command of Southern forces in Charleston. Soldiers began training and drilling. Women were waving handkerchiefs at drilling soldiers, ships leaving and coming to the harbor. Supplies were being rapidly gathered. And the Horry Dispatch actually reprinted a letter from the end of, it was dated March 30th. The letter describes a boat tour hosted by General Beauregard It consisted of some South Carolina citizens and the Confederate convention. During this boat tour, they toured around fortifications throughout the Charleston harbor, and as they passed Sumter, who was controlled by the Union, the boat's band vigorously played Dixie as they passed and continued. This article kind of shows like a brazen and arrogant tone that the dispatch had. Just a few weeks after this tour, we see the bombardment of Fort Sumter. Confederate forces attacked the Union-controlled fort for 32 hours. They went through artillery fire, and ultimately it resulted in Union surrender. With this confrontation, it was accumulation of decades worth of sectional tensions. There were no casualties, but this battle did mark the official start of the Civil War. With the official start, calls for soldiers began. You see the Horry Dispatch published calls for unions, not as recruitment ads, just kind of showing that like they were doing it, so we need to as well. They published an article for Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers. They also post articles about Lincoln's demands for the rebels to lay down their arms. After Sumter, 4 additional southern states joined the Confederacy. The Union declared General Winfield Scott as the Union's general-in-chief, taking control of the command. And during this time, the Anaconda Plan began to take shape. Whoops, skipped one. So this was kind of just more about those notices within the Horry Dispatch, kind of showed they were asking for Horry volunteers. They had several battalions made Horry volunteers, mounted rangers, PD Legion, and the Waccamaw Light Artillery. Women were also starting to furnish supplies for the soldiers, and citizens continued to provide lumber and additional material that they were able to give. So as I said before, the Anaconda Plan began to take focus. General Winfield Scott proposed this plan to suppress the Confederacy by shutting down access to supplies. They heavily focused on a blockade of the southern ports, especially in Charleston. The Horry Dispatch actually reported that Washington was excited to see this news about blockades. The blockade proved to be pretty successful. The South's cotton industry was greatly affected. Material was unable to pass freely from Confederate hands. It caused a lot of issues with England, with the Union. England's textile industry was greatly dependent on Southern cotton. So when the blockade interfered with that, there were some problems. So the Horry Dispatch actually reprinted several articles from England about the blockade. One article from the London Post said, "The harbor of Charleston belongs to the world and cannot be given up to an inefficient blockade." English textile industry continued to raise alarm when it came to it, and tried to encourage the ending of the blockade where they could. With England showing their irritation with the Union, the Confederacy began to hope for foreign intervention, both from England and a little bit from France as well. The Horry Dispatch often reported on the Confederacy's confidence for this foreign support. They believed the commercial ties would be incentive enough for England to enter and support the Confederacy. The Dispatch reprinted from the New York Herald that the English were too sensible and practical people to sacrifice their material interests. The Horry Dispatch named Brazil as a natural ally to the South, and they also mentioned that Cuba should concern itself with Southern independence because of close commercial ties. The Confederacy continued to believe that it was just a matter of time until England and France recognized them. They believed that by the early February of 1862, it was guaranteed. So the Horry Dispatch continued to print several articles from English papers. Another one from the Liverpool Mercury. They used these newspapers to also kind of support Southern idea for secession. They used the Liverpool Mercury to support the idea, and they had said, "Indeed, we might say certain that northern states were the first seceders. The whole North would have been the party desiring to secede from the South, since they have so long urged their desire to be disconnected from the guilt of slavery." So during this whole excitement, I guess, for foreign intervention, we see the Mason-Slidell affair happen. It's also called the Trent Affair. During this, you see 2 English diplomats were taken captive by Union officials in November of 1861. They were in America meeting with Confederate officials to talk about future recognizing and diplomacy. The arresting of Mason and Slidell caused a blow up in the tensions between the Union and the England. The Horry Dispatch reprinted a lot of English newspapers about the Mason-Slidell affair. They often pushed about the hostility that the English people were feeling. A London correspondent of the New York Times reported that nearly the whole English nation, including the mob, are revolting in literal madness on account of the alleged insult to the English flag. During this time, rumors of England entering the war as a combatant were surfacing. The Confederacy felt that this would completely guarantee English support, but eventually Mason and Slidell were surrendered and returned to England in January of 1862. The tone throughout the Horry Dispatch continued to remain pretty confident, and it brimmed with Southern patriotism. Even though the hope of foreign intervention fizzled out with the surrendering of Mason and Slidell, the Confederacy still stayed pretty optimistic. However, that did begin to change as time went on. You start to see rumors of retaliation and fear kind of became to be prevalent within the Horry Dispatch. Articles started being published that were rife with fears about land seizures, confiscation of property, the emancipation of enslaved Africans. Some rumors stated that General McClellan would slay all the secessionists and give seized land to Union loyalists. Some articles spread the belief that Lincoln was arresting secession sympathizers in New York. Another article that was published talked about, from the New York Tribune, it was reprinted in the Horry Dispatch, and it talked about the dividing of farms in both Maryland and Virginia among Northerners. Another rumor that circulated throughout the Horry Dispatch was a bill that Lincoln had introduced talking about taking control of telegraph lines. And if there was any interfering with these lines, they'd be faced with the death penalty. It also talked about more of taking control of all cotton lands within the South. There was also other rumors that the southern states would be placed under governorships when they were conquered, is quoted within the Horry Dispatch. There was rumors that Lincoln would appoint governors, mostly abolitionists and other northern congressmen. And the articles holding anti-union sentiments continued pretty consistently throughout the dispatch. The paper continued to praise the Confederacy for overcoming, but they also declared that the war waged by the United States against the Confederate States is unconstitutional and repugnant to civilization. As the conflicts grew more gruesome and the casualties increased, the reality of war became apparent for Horry County citizens, and the tone shifted even more. So now I'm going to give it to Connor, who's going to talk more in depth about combat seen in the Horry Dispatch.
Hello, everyone. Ooh, I'm loud. So, the Dispatch's coverage of the early fighting illustrates the heightened enthusiasm for the Confederacy's beginnings, exhibiting the strength, fervor, and moral virtuousness of the South and its people. The Dispatch not only played an important role in providing the citizens of Horry County with mostly up-to-date strategic and military developments occurring in the several different fronts of combat, but was also integral in informing public morale. This is especially important given the context that my colleagues have provided, that Horry County was poor. I want to emphasize that we're very poor at this point. We could not offer much in the way of money or more materials for the war effort. So the one thing that we could provide was men, population. And this is very important for morale, obviously, because it's one thing in just providing money. It's another thing in sending people to die for a cause. So this is evident in the beginning, even before the war, where you have stories like this that are meant to raise spirits for a possible fight. And this work. And stuff like this, where there is an evidence showing that this is a war that is going to happen. Like, this is going to happen. There is no coming back from this, right? We are preparing for a war. This is what the newspaper is attempting to show. Showing troop movements, showing blazoned speeches of a new civilization coming to be. All for the service, especially for Horry County, even though they borrow from other papers, the specific tailoring of the editorials is for the purpose of rallying men and rallying general home front sentiment. This is just one function that was seen. But another difficulty with this morale is seen just in the first battle, where the successes and failures of the Confederacy are not simply reported, but narrativized, in which any victory is a devastating blow to the Union, illustrative of federal army, military, and administrative incompetence, and which every defeat is a martyrdom, an injustice to civility that displays the barbaric nature of Yankee tyranny. Fort Sumter, as my colleague said, no one died. It was a symbolic victory. It was one that launched the Confederacy into the Civil War in historiography, but one that is just one part of a grander development against the Union. Another important bit of information is that this was published on April 18th. The Battle of Fort Sumter happened on the 12th. Now, this is going to be a issue as the war goes on with getting the information on time and getting the information, especially from the battlefields, accurate. This agenda for the military is further reinforced by inescapable lags in the flow of information, a common tendency in the dispatch's reporting, most apparently seen in its war correspondence. Correspondents, many of whom were young, inexperienced, as many more seasoned correspondents enlisted in or drafted in the military, eagerly reported the outcomes and death tolls of engagements too early before the fighting finished. This resulted in several errors and discrepancies between Southern and Northern newspapers, many of which were left uncorrected or obfuscated in their importance by concerns of morale. So, from here, this is where, before any major battle happens, but where a lot of the propaganda starts, elevating. The Star of the West is an important example of this. The Star of the West was a supply ship to Fort Sumter that was hired out by the government, I believe, in January, and was shelled by cadets at the Citadel in that same January. They didn't hit it, but they tried. And in this issue, they're talking about it being captured in Matagorda Bay, transporting troops to Texas. And this is almost an entire column dedicated to it. And it might seem insignificant to someone who's just kind of thinking of the Civil War as just big battles, but stuff like this matters to you if you're fighting and dying, or before you're even really fighting and dying, you're just trying to enlist as many people as possible and enlist as many materials. First fighting, covering the first fight that happens in the Civil War, the first soldier-to-soldier ground combat that happens, that isn't just two battleships fighting. you could already see that there's a whole lot of narrativization happening here. As we move forward, they talk about the battle as being the first bayonet charge of the Civil War. They give several examples of how there are brave men and women who are doing unbelievable acts of heroism against incompetent, stupid Union soldiers, which accelerates even more when there is a major victory that happens for the Confederacy in the Battle of Bull Run. The Battle of Bull Run is probably the first major battle, the first one that has over 1,000 deaths. And it's a significant victory because, especially for the Horry Dispatch, it's one that gets by far the most coverage out of any battle in its entire run, even in much larger battles like Shiloh or Corinth or the capture of New Orleans. This gets at least a solid month of pure coverage, trying to scrape through every single detail of it. And the Confederacy certainly beat the Union, but it was certainly in its coverage riding on the coattails of the excitement of this, as is seen here. There was never more complete a victory. The enemy was completely routed, retreating in confusion towards Alexandria, leaving the field of battle covered with their dead. Very dishonorable Union here. Now, this is just one of many articles. As seen here, this is a personal account of a soldier who kills one and stabs another and runs behind a tree and then shoots another, just like kind of, and this individual is in the South Carolina 10th Infantry, which was the infantry unit that scoured the most Horry County men. This is another event of showing the confusion of the Union and the stupidity of the Union soldiers, as seen by the Confederates, where there was instances of the Confederates, a Union general surgeon confusing the Confederacy for their own unit. And there was another one where Confederate soldiers were captured by a small troop of Union soldiers, and those Union soldiers then brought the captured Confederate men to a Confederate battle unit, thinking it was their own battle unit. So this is a common occurrence. This is very interesting. So they were riding it's hard to kind of explain how much of a high the Confederacy was riding on after the Battle of Manassas. This only scrapes the surface of that. So the governor of South Carolina sent a personal letter, or not a personal letter, but a very public letter to the governor of Massachusetts, asking him to bring down the Massachusetts infantry to fight the South Carolina men square on, like not in a battlefield, but like a sophisticated display of the showing the might of the Carolina soldiers relative to the Massachusetts ones. Moving forward, a year later, one of the largest battles in all the Confederacy happens, the Battle of Shiloh. This one gets significant coverage as well, but this more so illustrates the difficulties of war coverage of the time lag. So as seen right here on the right, this is a letter that was telegraphed by Beauregard showing the complete victory of the Battle of Shiloh on April 7th. Now, the Battle of Shiloh was a multi-day battle. At this point in the battle, the Union was on a retreat. But a day later, this was written at night, a day later in the morning, the Union came back strong and decimated the Confederate forces and sent them retreating back to Corinth. And we don't have this is, I believe, the April 10th issue. We don't have the April 17th issue of this. So we do not have the update, if there ever was one, that they actually lost Shiloh. And then in the next issues, and I think this is early May, when they're talking about the Battle of Corinth, they do not bring up Shiloh at all, even though it was incredibly devastating. Tens of thousands of men died. They do not bring it up. This is all they talk about. They talk about it. They talk about Shiloh still as the second affair at Manassas. So they're still claiming it's a victory, even though several records have come out, especially in northern newspapers, that this is a defeat. Like, this was a strategic loss, like a fundamental loss. This is only further reinforced in the Battle of New Orleans by General Farragut. Capture of New Orleans. New Orleans is, of course, a big shipping big shipping port at the mouth of the Mississippi. The sentiment around New Orleans is not even seen as a loss. It was a capture, but they portrayed it as very much an act of resistance. It is not a surrender. We are not surrendering. We are still fighting the Union. No matter what, no matter if they're occupying the streets, no matter if they're burning all of our stuff, we are still fighting them. We are still rebelling against them. We're not going to let them win, essentially, is what they're trying to say. Now, this doesn't mean much if they're still losing. The governor of South Carolina had issued several more drafts demanding more Union soldiers because the Confederacy does not have a lot of resources, Horry County more so. And you can't risk sending 10,000 men to die in Shiloh and have that be replenished month after month after month. So even if they're having this like blazing battles and these heroic moments, you're still dwindling at a faster rate than the Union is. And this is where things get very serious, where it becomes less of a rhetorical battle or a rallying flag. This is where, the enemy is on our doorstep. The Union had been capturing small islands because of the blockade. The Union had been capturing small islands off the coast of South Carolina in the south near Hilton Head. They captured Edisto Island, and they were shelling Port Royal for a while. Major plantations. Tens of thousands of slaves and plantation owners occupied these islands. A large amount of them had to flee until in May, where they finally did capture Port Royal. And at this point, you have Union soldiers moving into massive plantations, and the plantation owners just leave their slaves there. And essentially the Union frees the slaves and sets up townships and appropriates land for the slaves to work, and also drafts a few slaves for military operations that will be pivotal in the early invasions and scouting of the coastal regions, as was seen here. And an important point is that this was getting very, very serious. These weren't just small incursions. At this point, the Confederate legislator had passed a law saying that no exports there could be no exports out of the port of Charleston without explicit permission from either the governor or from the legislator itself. And the governor and the South Carolina legislator had also passed a law ordering martial law for the coastal districts, including Horry County, where they had to appoint a police force, and they had to appoint a marshal officer to be in charge of the things. And they had additional restrictions for people living in Charleston, because Charleston is very integral. Moving further, the incursions were getting very, 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 very close. This is an important one, important event in Georgetown, where a Union ship that was piloted by a formerly enslaved person that was freed in, I think, Edisto Island, came from the Atlantic up the Georgetown River and told the local residents to take down a Confederate flag that was waving in the wind. And the Confederates that were stationed there, the citizens, essentially told him to do it yourself. And then he didn't, and he shipped past the river, burnt some stuff, and eventually made its way back to the Atlantic. But at this point, it's hard to kind of get a gauge of what the attitudes were during this time, because it's certainly not like victorious valor, excitement in the same way as it was at the beginning of the war, but it was certainly not dejection. It was more of like a fear. It was a hardened fear that Jordan mentioned, where there is a serious like threat that is coming, and they don't know when and they don't know where, but it just raises general suspicion. But it's certainly not dejection. There was a small article where a mother of a soldier mother in Georgetown of a soldier who was fighting, I think in a Virginia company, was saying that if my son dies, I will kill Lincoln myself. So that's sort of the attitude that's going into this. So I'll leave it to Jordan to finish this presentation.
Hi, I'm coming back up here just to kind of wrap up the Horry Dispatch, how it ended, and give some final just interesting dates about Horry County. So first off, the Horry Dispatch was published weekly from 1861 until the spring of 1862. But the blockade not only impacted local areas around here, it also impacted newsprints heavily. So the blockade caused the Horry Dispatch to have to cut their papers to 1/2 of a sheet. But by August of 1862, it caused such a lack in the necessary products for the newspaper that it just ceased to exist. The Horry Dispatch was there no longer. And the ending of it caused Horry County to once again become the only district without a local paper. After the ending of the Horry Dispatch, Osteen, who was the first operator of it, would join the Confederate forces. Initially after it, he did bounce around from a few different newspaper houses, but he decided that he wanted to put a foot into the race. And initially, he was sent to Charleston, and he printed Confederate money. But he would go on to become a general later from his service. And after the war and everything, he would get out and he would become a publisher of newspapers himself. So he published The Watchman and South Run and remained really local to Sumter. He worked in it until his death in 1936, and he died from complications after being struck by a car while riding his bicycle. Joseph T. Walsh, who came on later and took on editorial aspects of the newspaper, remained local to the Conway area. He served as a judge here, and he would die in Conway in 1904. So both of their roots remained really local to our area. And just some background on Horry itself. In the beginning, naval stores were very popular in here in the 1850s, and they just continued to expand. In the 1870s, naval stores were still a big boom around here. Riverboats on the Waccamaw River between Georgetown and Conway helped establish it and push it forward a little more to get people out here as we needed. In 1883, the General Assembly decided to shorten the name Conway Borough to Conway, as it's still referred to today. In 1887, the railroad and telegraph lines came to Conway for the first time. In 1898, the town incorporated, and we elected our first mayor. And in the early 1900s, Conway would become the #1 producing county for tobacco in South Carolina. So that's just some interesting dates. And I'm going to have Dr. John Navin come back up.
Well, I think you'll agree with me, there's been some very interesting material covered here. One thing I want to make clear is that this project, this is the Prince Fellows Project, this did not start out as an effort to find interesting stories and tell you about them in a PowerPoint. This started out as an effort to dig into these newspapers and to analyze them and dissect them and catalog them in a way that other students, other scholars, the general public could use them. I'm sure a number of these slides that were put up, you looked at and said, I can't read anything there. It's dark, it's faded, there's print missing, there's parts that are covered over with ink or dirt or who knows what. It was the task of these students to go in and beginning with the first paper and going through all 23, some of which are 4 pages long, to look at every article and every column on every page and to catalog each one of those. So this presentation that you saw today, they've put some time into this, but first they put a year into digging into those papers and doing that cataloging. So that's been a tremendous effort on their part. And while 5 years from now, the presentation they gave today might just be some dusty file and some dusty laptop, the work that they did in cataloging this might still be used by scholars, not just 5 years from now, but well into the future. They've been a very busy group. The first talk that was presented on their work was given to the Society of 19th Century Historians. This was a national meeting. This is the type of place that scholars will go, people like myself, teaching history full-time and writing articles and papers, and we get together once a year, different venues to present to each other what we've found, what we're writing. Well, they had this paper presented at this conference, this national conference, in between things presented by other professional historians, and they won a research award. If you go on the website for the 19th century historians, this is what you see, this picture of these Coastal Carolina students acknowledging their effort. But this is hardly all that they've been doing lately. These are some of the presentations that they either have done or have yet to do. As I said, the 19th Century Symposium they did. They presented at the Coastal Carolina Humanities Week. We're very delighted to be presenting today at the Horry County Museum. I say we. They're doing the hard work. I'm just doing some talking, right? They are going to be presenting for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute very shortly. They are going to be presenting, on the bottom right, you see, the South Carolina Historical Association annual meeting. Again, this is a meeting of historians who are getting together to present their best work, and these students are going to be there presenting their work, and it's going to hold up right there with the others, I can tell you that. And then finally, the Phi Alpha Theta Regional Conference. Phi Alpha Theta is the National History Society, History Honor Society, and we have the honor of hosting the regional North Carolina, South Carolina meeting this year at Coastal, and that I think will be their final presentation where they will give this talk or some version of it finally at that. Moving ahead, they're still not done, right? They are about to undertake an article. They're going to co-author an article for a Bridges magazine, which is produced by Coastal Carolina University by students. And we hope that at some point there will be a museum exhibit right here where some of the work that they've done, some of the more interesting articles and some of the illustrations they've put together will be available in one of the display rooms for the general public to come in and see. If things work out right, this database that they have compiled that has these descriptions of each bit of information, each article in that paper, that database will be publicly available. Right now, you can get in to see the newspapers online. That's maintained by the Historical Society. I believe the repository right now is actually at the USC libraries, but you can link to it through the Horry Historical Society, and we hope that the database that's being created will be put up online as well, and you'll be able to find your way into those newspapers more easily thanks to their work. So with that, let me just say there may be some questions. We want to give them a chance to take some questions and offer some answers. But before I do that, we do have to be sure to thank the Princes. Dr. Wink and Sally Prince are here with us today, and it's due to their generosity that Coastal Carolina can fund projects like this through the Prince Fellows Project. So I would ask that you might want to give the students a hand after they've done their question and answer, but right now I'd like to give a hand to the Princes and thank them very much for their help, okay?